Hidden away off the high street in the old market town of Knaresborough, away from the hustle and the bustle of the masses and the visitors, lay a decades-old secret to Knaresborough's past, the old cattle market. The market has laid derelict for more than a quarter of a century, simply closed off and untouched. But with the town having less than 16,000 residents, it seemed odd having a market there in the first place. But Knaresborough wasn't alone. Cattle markets like this were abundant in most towns around England and grew in Victorian times, and the railways might have been the cause. Before the railways were a thing, one of the biggest problems farmers faced was the movement of their animals. For many hundreds of years, it was common to see animals being herded along country roads on their way to market. Considering the average speed of driving these animals by foot, progress getting these animals to the market and to the butcher shops was slow and would take several days. The animals would arrive tired and stressed, and as any butcher knows, any stress on the animal would affect the meat and the end product. Almost as early as the railways themselves, there were calls to solve this problem, and the railways were keen to oblige. At first, cattle and other animals were simply placed into boxcars, but as the need increased, it was decided that a specialist van would need to be built. These wagons would be sturdy, with high sides and well ventilated. The wood floor would be covered with shavings and would eliminate the chances of the animals slipping, and it was written into regulations that the vans had to be the first part of any consist of mixed goods and must be the closest to the engine under a specific coupling. This was to ensure the animals were as comfortable as possible and not jostled about. To further help both farmers and the animals, stations, especially those in the country, created a specific platform called a cattle dock. These platforms were raised higher than the normal passenger platforms, were ramp accessible, were wider, and had pens off the dock to house the animals ready for transport. The platform was perfectly level with the floor of the trucks, allowing the animals to board step-free, rather than the farmers having to go miles. This made the journey for getting the animals to the market a lot easier. Towns suddenly found that this new and fast way to move livestock, and to a lesser extent food, was a real godsend, and towns and cities saw a real shopping boom. Meat and other produce were becoming easier to access, and towns flourished with more shops opening than ever. Cattle markets that would only have a few animals per week were forced to become bigger and built special pens for the sales. As butchers' demands increased, some towns even opened up abattoirs so the meat would be in the shops within days of arrival. It was simple and it kept the country fed. Farmers were also keen to show off their best as well. In the days before artificial insemination, bulls had to be taken to cows to service them. Normally, the bull would be walked from field to field and had a limited range. The railway would allow bulls to travel all over the country. British Railways recognised this precious cargo and built a special cattle van for this purpose. These vans were literally first class for the bulls. They were fully enclosed for private use, had steam heating for warmth, adjustable windows for air circulation, wood battens were secured to the floor providing grip, and their own guardsman who travelled in his own private area who were responsible for them for every part of the journey. The herdsman saw the bulls on and off the ramp and tended to them all the way through. The bulls were not only paraded for the ladies, but opened up opportunities to appear in many country shows, and with it more titles and of course more work. But as the cattle goods were at its peak, the movement of imports were growing. Improvements in freezing and refrigeration meant that more processed meat were coming in than ever. This cheaper and already processed meat was a lure to many shops. Shops began to sell more than just its core product, and the first supermarkets began to emerge. These super shops would house everything the common consumer would need without the fuss from going from place to place. Smaller shops were outcompeted by these bigger supermarkets, and they began to close, and with it many butchers. British Rail was not blind to this shift and started to slow progress on its cattle trains. The farmers also started to turn away from the rails for its cattle movements too. Improvements in motorways and wagons meant it was more economical for them to drive the wagons themselves should they need to go to market, and abattoirs started sending wagons direct to the farm to collect the animals for butchering. By the mid-1960s, the cattle trade on the rails had slowed to a crawl, and by 1975, British Rail called halt on these trains for good. Owing to the high acidity in cattle manure, many trucks were deemed beyond economic repair to keep, and many were scrapped. But the Railway Museum has 2 in its collection, and many survive around on heritage sites. The first van the museum owns is a special cattle van. This was built in 1951 and was one of 10 built, and designed to replace some built in the 1930s. It's currently at Shildon after undergoing a full restoration and is only one of a handful of show wagons that survive. The second wagon is much older and was built pre-grouping by the London, Brighton and South Coast Railway. This wagon number 53291 spent most of its time in the Isle of Wight before being shipped back to the mainland after it was withdrawn. It was in a terrible state, but the museum saw its potential and purchased the van for restoration. The Wright Locomotive Society also saw the wagon's appeal and offered to collaborate. The wagon was restored and is now on permanent loan back on the Isle of Wight. It's become too easy to give thought as to where our food comes from nowadays. Food is often processed and ready to cook, taking a few minutes in the microwave or 15 or so minutes in the air fryer. Our world today and the pressures of working mean that we simply don't have the time to prepare like our parents and grandparents used to. But I do recommend, if you can, wandering to the shops and going to your local butcher and spending that little bit extra. It's time and money well spent, and I love nothing better than to have a local homemade burger while watching the trains race by me window.